5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 1833, the DHS Industrial Control Systems Capability Enhancement Act of 2021, H.R. 1850, the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act, H.R. 1870, the Strengthening Local Transportation Securities Capabilities Act of 2021, H.R. 1871, the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, H.R. 1877, the Security Screening During COVID-19 Act, H.R. 1893, the Transportation Security Preparedness Act of 2021, H.R. 1895, the Transportation Security Public Health Preparedness Act of 2021. The chair wishes to announce that to the extent practicable, it is my intentions to take any recorded votes as they are requested and to not roll votes, and that the chair may recess the committee at any point. Without objections, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'm pleased that we're here today to consider 7 bipartisan Homeland Security measures. A few of the bills were passed out of the House in prior Congresses, while the rest are new and very timely. It's been a little over a year since COVID-19 became a global pandemic. COVID has fundamentally changed the way people live, learn, congregate, and work. Over the past year, as business has moved from offices into Zoom rooms, commercial aviation has significantly impacted. However, we're starting to see Americans feel more comfortable about traveling as the U.S. leads the world in the number of people fully vaccinated and better COVID-19 therapeutics are developed. In fact, according to TSA, in just the last week, the rate of people screened at TSA checkpoints has steadily ramped up over 1 million people per day. For their part, airlines are reporting increased bookings and a stabler operational picture as more shots go into arms. While everyone is eager for a return to normalcy, this summer, the CDC is still recommending against non-essential travel and warning that we could see additional spikes in cases if we do not stay vigilant in containing this virus. Further, over 7,000 positive cases within the TSA workforce. We know that more must be done to ensure TSA is fully prepared to keep its frontline employees safe during this pandemic and in the future outbreaks. I'm pleased that we are considering 3 bills originating from the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee focused on protecting TSA's frontline workforce and the traveling public now and long after the coronavirus pandemic has abated. They are H.R. 1893, the Transportation Security Preparedness Act of 2021, as introduced by Subcommittee Chairwoman Watson Coleman, H.R. 1877, the Security Screening During COVID-19 Act, as introduced by Representative Cleaver, and H.R. 1895, the Transportation Security Public Threats Preparedness Act, as introduced by Ranking Member Jimenez. Additionally, I'm pleased that we are considering timely measures to bolster support to state and local law enforcement as they work to address a complex range of threats, not the least of which is domestic terrorism. One bill sponsored by Border Security Chairwoman Barragan would bolster information sharing about threats to high-risk surface transportation systems, and the other, sponsored by Representative Rice, would ensure that DHS continues to carry out critical research and development of protective equipment and other technology needed by first responders. We're also considering H.R. 1833 as introduced by Ranking Member Katko, which is focused on improving CISA's ability to detect and mitigate cyber threats and vulnerabilities to industrial control systems, and H.R. 1871, as introduced by Mr. Bishop, that seeks to improve transparency in TSA policymaking. At this time, my understanding is that there's broad bipartisan support for the notice measures that the amendments that were circulated today. I thank the ranking member and his staff for working with me and my staff in a cooperative way ahead of today's markup. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I echo your sentiments about the bipartisan manner in which we are going forward here. I think it's very important that holding this bipartisan markup and our continued commitment to working with me and the Republican members of this committee to find common sense legislative solutions to Homeland Security challenges. I look forward to approving all the bipartisan bills and amendments on the roster today. Specifically, I commend Representative Bishop for introducing H.R. 1871, the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, which brings important transparency to TSA's sensitive security information policies and its security directive and emergency amendment process. I want to also thank Representative Jimenez for his leadership on H.R. 1895, the Transportation Security Public Health Threat Preparedness Act, which importantly requires TSA to analyze the preparedness of the transportation security system for future public health threats. I'm also happy to co-sponsor my friend, Chairwoman Watson Coleman's Transportation Security Preparedness Act. Along with Mr. Jimenez's bill, H.R. 1893 will help ensure TSA is prepared for the impacts of COVID-19 and future public health pandemics on transportation security. I also want to thank fellow New Yorkers, my friends Kathleen Rice and Ranking Member Garbarino, for bringing important legislation back before us today. H.R. 1850, the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act, carries on the strong leadership of former New York Representatives Peter King and Dan Donovan in supporting our nation's law enforcement and first responders, especially in New York City, to protect against and respond to acts of terrorism. Additionally, I want to thank the chairman and other members for supporting my bill today, H.R. 1833, the Department of Homeland Security Industrial Control Systems Capabilities Enhancement Act. As I've said from day one as ranking member of this committee, we need to continue to bolster cybersecurity capabilities at CISA to defend our federal networks and the nation's critical infrastructure from cyber threats. Already in 2021, the nation is confronting potentially 2 major cyber incidents facing federal and private sector networks. While the full scope of those attacks is still being determined, we have also seen the potential for real-world consequences in an attack against a water treatment plant in Florida, where hackers gained access to industrial control systems and altered the mixture of chemicals, potentially leading to fatalities. This attack reinforces the need to solidify CISA's lead role in protecting our nation's critical infrastructure from cyber threats, particularly industrial control systems that underpin vital components of our daily lives. This bill requires a system director to maintain capabilities to detect and mitigate threats and vulnerabilities affecting automated control of critical infrastructure, particularly industrial control systems. This includes maintaining cross-sector incident response capabilities to respond to cybersecurity incidents and providing cybersecurity technical assistance to stakeholders. Lastly, the CISA director will be required to collect, coordinate, and provide vulnerability information to the industrial control systems community. This bill is one step in the committee's continued efforts to build up CISA's authorities and resources to effectively carry out its mission. And it's a resounding statement to have such heavy-hitting bipartisan support, and I appreciate that. I appreciate Representative Bacon for his leadership on this bill in the 115th Congress. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continuing to work together in a bipartisan manner with you and other members on this committee to move these and other common sense bills through the committee and onto the House floor. It's really the hallmark, I believe, of what this committee is all about. It's one of the most bipartisan in all of Congress, and it's a pleasure to be part of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Katko. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, Mr. Chairman, Would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion or consideration of the roster. Additionally, it's my understanding there is bipartisan agreement on the bills and the amendments thereto. Accordingly, the chair will be asking unanimous consent to consider the bills and the amendments thereto en bloc in the interest of time. The members with bills or amendments included in the en bloc will be recognized for a statement at the conclusion of the markup.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I now call up H.R. 1833, H.R. 1870, and H.R. 1877. I ask unanimous consent that the bills be discharged from their respective subcommittees and be considered en bloc without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 1833, H.R. 1870, H.R. 1877.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bills and amendments filed on the roster were circulated in advance and printed. Copies are available. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1833, H.R. 1870, and H.R. 1877, together with the amendments listed on the roster, be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 1850, H.R. 1871, H.R. 1893, and H.R. 1895, and ask unanimous consent that the bills be discharged from their respective subcommittees and be considered en bloc. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 1850, H.R. 1871, H.R. 1893, H.R. 1895.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bills were circulated in advance and printed copies are available. There were no amendments pre-filed for these bills. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1850, H.R. 1871, H.R. 1893, and H.R. 1895 be adopted and ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Does any member seek recognition to speak on the adopted bills?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would it be appropriate now to speak on H.R. 1833?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I want to thank you and commend you for your leadership of the committee, particularly the attention you've paid to cybersecurity over the many years that you've chaired the committee or been on the committee. Additionally, I just wanted to speak quickly regarding my amendment to the ranking member's bill, H.R. 1833, the DHS Industrial Control Systems Capabilities Enhancement Act. First of all, let me congratulate Mr. Katko for his continued leadership on cybersecurity issues on this committee. Last Congress, the gentleman from New York and I worked together closely on several bills and amendments implementing recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and I'm happy to renew that partnership this year. I'm a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 1833, which codifies CISA's role as the lead federal agency focused on the protection of operational technology, or OT. As more and more of our critical infrastructure becomes networked, securing the OT that controls physical processes only increases in importance, and Mr. Katko's bill is a timely one that will further strengthen CISA. My amendment is simple. It clearly delineates the role of the sector risk management agencies, or SRMAs, with respect to securing OT. Mr. Chairman, as you know, I authored language in the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act codifying the roles and responsibilities of SRMAs. Each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors has one or more SRMAs dedicated to, in a non-regulatory fashion, helping to ensure the security of the members of the sector. SRMAs help run the public-private partnerships that are so vital to success in defending against cyber threats, and they are a vital source of domain expertise and contacts within their fields. After all, the impact of a cyber vulnerability and the best way to mitigate it can vary widely across the different sectors. So SRMAs provide a vital link to CISA's cybersecurity expertise, and they are also responsible for providing data about their sectors so CISA can better understand risks that cut across sectors. After all, as we saw last month during storms in the South, power plants in the energy sector are often highly reliant on pipelines in the transportation sector. So my amendment specifically calls out SRMAs to further clarify their roles with respect to CISA regarding operational technology. As the lead agency for securing OT, CISA needs to work with SRMAs to get the word out to private sector stakeholders and get feedback from critical infrastructure owners and operators. This is separate and distinct from CISA's responsibilities to other federal agencies that use industrial control systems, like the Bureau of Reclamation, which owns and operates hundreds of dams across the country and which relies on CISA for advice on how to secure its own systems. So I look forward to continue to work with my colleagues to strengthen the network of SRMAs led by CISA, working as partners with critical infrastructure to protect our nation in cyberspace. With that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Katko for developing this important bill and accepting my amendment. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership again in convening this markup. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Recognize the next person. Let me say that if you want to speak on any of the bills under consideration, just feel free to seek recognition and we will recognize you. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, and thank you also to Ranking Member Katko for your leadership in convening this markup and for considering H.R. 1871, the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act. This is my second time introducing this legislation, which passed unanimously by this committee last year. The bill is an important piece of legislation that enhances the security at the Transportation Security Administration by ensuring better communication between the agency and stakeholders in the transportation industry. This legislation makes two common sense improvements to ensure the Transportation Security Administration effectively communicates with stakeholders. First, this bill directs the Transportation Security Administration to ensure the guidance and designation on sensitive security information, also known as SSI, is clear and consistent. SSI is information that, if made public, would be detrimental to transportation security. While many transportation security stakeholders are authorized to view SSI, inconsistent designation and redaction of SSI can unnecessarily hinder the flow of critical information used to secure the nation's transportation networks. This legislation guarantees that the administrator of TSA regularly reviews and updates SSI identification guidelines. In an effort to ensure transportation stakeholders are properly heard, this bill also requires TSA to actively engage with transportation security stakeholders throughout the SSI process. My bill also addresses the security directive and emergency amendment processes and their impacts on international aviation security. Air carriers are required to meet TSI security requirements, but TSA may supplement basic security requirements through security directives or emergency amendments based on known threats. To improve this process, this bill requires the administrator to develop and implement guidelines that ensure appropriate inclusion of air carriers and other relevant stakeholders in the development and implementation of security directives and emergency amendments. These guidelines must also ensure that new security directives or emergency amendments have defined security outcomes and encourage the consultation of foreign partners. This common sense legislation will improve aviation security by ensuring TSA clearly communicates critical security information and doesn't hide behind the bureaucratic process. I thank my colleagues for their support of the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan for 5 minutes. Ms. Slotts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to talk a little bit about the amendment that Pipe put forward on the 1870 Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities, introduced by Congresswoman Barragan. The amendment that we put forward would ensure that our state and regional fusion centers, so places like the Michigan State Police Intel Operations Center in Lansing, in my district, would have support from specially trained TSA officers, DHS Intel analysts to help protect our transportation systems. These professionals will work with state and local law enforcement to ensure that they have access to classified intelligence about threats of foreign and domestic terrorism and other violence targeting our transportation system. It's going to help things like Lansing's Capital Area Transportation Authority, CATA, which for so many of us is just how we know people get around in Lansing. And then as a former CIA analyst, we know that it's important that, for those who are imposed or charged with public safety, that they have a clear awareness of the threats both home and abroad. And it's not enough for the agencies to just produce this intelligence. Especially after January 6th, we need to get that intelligence into the hands of people on the ground when they need it. It's not just a one-way street. And that's an effort that I'm really proud to be taking on as chair of the Intel and Counterterrorism Subcommittee. So for this reason, the amendment requires GAO to conduct a thorough review of the intel sharing made possible by this bill, figure out how effective it is, and identify any additional gaps and how we share information to provide our transportation systems some support against violent and terrorist threats. Thank you to Congresswoman Barragan, the rest of my colleagues. I think it's an important show of bipartisanship, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes, Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and also Ranking Member Katko for holding this markup. The bill H.R. 1895, the Transportation Security Public Health Threat Preparedness Act, is an important piece of legislation that will ensure the United States transportation systems are better prepared for future public health threats. This bill directs the Transportation Security Administration to conduct an analysis of looming public health risks and to work with the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Human Services, and transportation stakeholders to develop a strategy regarding the challenges public health risks pose to our transportation systems. The analysis will describe TSA's security checkpoint policies and procedures to protect TSA personnel, passengers, aviation workers, and airport personnel from public health threats. Additionally, this bill instructs TSA to brief Congress on this analysis following its conclusion. Finally, this legislation would authorize non-frontline TSA personnel to be detailed to other DHS components and federal departments and agencies to improve coordination, to prepare for, protect against, and respond to future public health threats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
For 5 minutes, Mr. Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I apologize. I'm in my district and physically unable to have the attire that's required of us, but I'd like to be recognized on my bill.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past year, I've watched the transportation security officers at the Kansas City International Airport in action as I've flown in and out of Washington on a weekly basis. And over the course of the pandemic, the workers at airports all across the country have been forced to adapt to new ways of carrying out their responsibilities while keeping passengers safe from another threat, the coronavirus. Uh, Now, we all, I think, are willing and glad to acknowledge the fact that the light is at the end of the tunnel, and it has been growing brighter with the president's recent announcement that all adults in the United States will be eligible for the coronavirus vaccine by May 1st. And so we still must remain vigilant. I'm troubled that last week, the number of cases among TSA employees, these are our employees, increased, even as cases among the general population continue to decrease. And that's why my bill, the Security Screening During COVID-19 Act, directs TSA to come up with a plan to enhance security operations during the current pandemic that is informed by the best practices of international and domestic security partners. The TSA administrator will conduct the DHS chief medical officer, will coordinate rather with that officer and consult with HHS and CDC to develop an actionable plan that identifies best practices among foreign governments, airports, and air carriers regarding COVID-19. The administrator will pinpoint specific operational changes that TSA can make to further reduce the spread of coronavirus at our nation's checkpoints. Importantly, my bill authorizes TSA to consult with stakeholders and TSA workforce groups when they develop the plan. My bill also directs the Comptroller General to report on the plan 1 year after the plan is issued and implementation begins. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Maritime Security Subcommittee Chair Bonnie Watson Coleman, Ranking Member Jimenez, as well as Ranking Member Katko, and all of my colleagues for their support on this bill. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gabarino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ranking Member Katko. And I'm to speak on my bill. I also want to thank my fellow New Yorker, Ms. Rice, for reintroducing this important piece of legislation, H.R. 1850. I'm proud to fill the role of my predecessor, Pete King, by becoming an original co-sponsor for the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act. New Yorkers, and especially my constituents on Long Island, continue to deal with the aftermath of the terrorist attacks committed on September 11th, 2001. We are grateful for the sacrifices that numerous first responders made on that day and all that they continue to do to keep our communities safe. It is our intent through this bill to permanently authorize DHS National Urban Security Technology Laboratory to develop new technologies to assist first responders in preparing for and protecting against threats of terrorism like those experienced on that fateful day almost 20 years ago. I thank the committee in advance for their support of this bill to ensure that our entire nation maintains its technological advantage in protecting the homeland from terrorist attacks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Yes, we will recognize everyone we're trying to do in seniority. So we'll get to everyone, trust me. Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for recognizing me, and let me thank collectively the members who have offered legislation. TSA is an organization that was stood up after 9/11 and has been on the front lines. So those of us who travel realize that they have encountered a number of incidences, encounters with travelers. They lost a TSA agent in a shooting in California. So I want to particularly highlight legislation that involves Mr. Jimenez provided the transportation security public health threat. We know that when COVID-19 hit, TSA was one of the frontline agencies that was really unprepared. And the idea of having a stand-up system that allowed for that preparedness and protection, not only of them, but the traveling public. It was only after the fact that we began to see the kind of screening support systems and barriers that would help them avoid getting COVID-19. Their numbers were high in getting COVID-19, and they lost a life as well. So I want to acknowledge that legislation along with Mr. Cleaver's legislation dealing with the security screening process during COVID-19, and to thank them for their legislation along with the other members. And then I'd like to particularly acknowledge the 1833 as it relates to CISA, and to indicate that, again, my emphasis has always been the sharing of information. This particular legislation, bipartisan DHS industrial control systems capabilities, reinforces the importance of the sharing of information. And as it relates to CISA and to maintain capabilities to identify threats to industrial system, I am reminded of our water systems. I'm reminded of our electric grid. These are issues that we've discussed over the years. Now we see the reality of the idea of the attacks on those very important systems, both public and private. I believe that we should continue to engage with public and private entities to discuss the cyber vulnerabilities, that we should share this information. This legislation moves in that direction in developing the communication grid, if you will, to help protect the American people. We cannot be lax on the potential of attacks on our system, and the lack of information clearly can be our Achilles heel in bringing our system, in essence, to its knees. So all of these bills that are before us today provide an enhanced infrastructure to the homeland, provides more security for the homeland. Our task, and I want to applaud the proponents of the legislation, will join them in the support. Hope they will move to the floor, and hope they will move to the Senate and become ultimately become law. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas yield back. Chair recognizes gentlelady from New Jersey for 5 minutes, Ms. Watson Coleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and thank all of my colleagues for supporting my bill, H.R. 1893, the Transportation Security Preparedness Act of 2021. As the world marks 1 year since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, more than 7,000 employees of the Transportation Security Administration have tested positive for the virus. And tragically, 15 of those hardworking frontline workers have lost their lives, 3 of whom were from the state of New Jersey. TSA has taken steps to shield its workers and adjust security operations during the pandemic, but more must be done to make sure TSA is adequately prepared for future disease outbreaks. My bill will ensure that TSA applies lessons learned from COVID-19 to protecting its workforce and the traveling public during a future communicable disease outbreak. The bill takes a two-pronged approach. First, it requires TSA to survey its workforce on how effectively it handled COVID-19 and develop a transportation security preparedness plan for future pandemics. The survey is to examine not only how well TSA communicated about the virus with its workforce, but how well it did at providing personal protective equipment and supporting contact tracing, and whether its frontline workforce believes that its policies with respect to scheduling, leave, and telework policies were adjusted in a manner that was responsive to their needs. Once the survey is completed, TSA is required to develop a transportation security preparedness plan to navigate future communicable disease outbreaks. In the plan, TSA is required to outline a pandemic response strategy that details how it will communicate and collaborate with relevant federal and private partners during a future pandemic, protect its workforce, adjust checkpoint operations to maximize hygiene and security, and assess obstacles to TSA's ability to respond. I again thank my colleagues for supporting this important piece of legislation. And before I yield back, I'd like to thank my partner on the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee, Mr. Jimenez, for working with me on my bill and express my support for his COVID-19 related bill, H.R. 1895. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you and Ranking Member Katko for working with me to prioritize action on my bill, H.R. 1850, the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act. Given this current threat environment, it is absolutely essential that we prioritize the research and development of new first responder technologies. H.R. 1850 would permanently authorize the New York City-based National Urban Security Technology Laboratory, which we all commonly refer to as NewSteel. The counterterrorism and emergency response work that NewSteel does directly supports our brave first responders, not only in New York City, but in urban areas across all 50 states. In fact, it is the only federal lab in the country that is focused entirely on helping first responders carry out their critical mission. The last administration proposed closing down NewSteel multiple times in its budgets, but I am glad this committee recognizes how short-sighted that would have been. NewSteel's work is critical, and it is needed now more than ever, given the threats that we face. I want to thank Congressman Andrew Garbarino, my fellow New Yorker, and Long Islander, for co-leading this legislation, and I thank the chair and ranking member for their support. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. We don't have any other members on the list, but in the interest of making sure we don't omit anyone, is there anyone on the markup that would want to be recognized that has not been recognized? Thank you very much. This concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today.
Mr. Chairman?
The Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills ordered reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member, Mr. Katko.
Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business to transact, the committee stands adjourned.